My name is Nils Mallock. I'm a PhD candidate at the London School of Economics. My research focuses on political action and specifically how people become motivated as individuals to engage in political action of different kinds. So across a full spectrum of political actions, from very moderate and cultural events all the way to violent extremism. I think it's helpful to begin by taking one step back and first clarify what exactly we mean by those terms. Extremism is often defined as having deep convictions that are opposed to the fundamental values of society, whereby radicalisation is then the process of acquiring such attitudes, beliefs, and potentially behaviours. But there's a bit of a problem here, right? Because what constitutes fundamental values of society can differ a lot depending on who you ask, certainly at the international level. But even within a country that is, say, divided between a political left and a political right, for example, you will find these groups accusing each other of being radical extremists quite frequently. So there's both an element of subjectivity here, and the term is very politicized, both of which is very difficult from a scientific standpoint. Now, having said that, there is some consensus between, for example, established democracies that extremism begins somewhere along the lines of where you are starting to advocate the supremacy of a specific group, or when you're rejecting the laws of democracy and universal human rights. It's something like that, and we can work on that working assumption. Now, psychology works at the individual level. So rather than looking at societal or group dynamics and structures, psychologists are interested in why people as individuals might be susceptible and engaging in political extremism. And out of that discipline comes a lot of different models and concepts, many of which use metaphors to illustrate their key points, such as a conveyor belt or a pyramid or a linear process with 4 or 8 or 9 steps or whatever it might be. But what they share in common is the idea that you don't turn into an extremist overnight, but rather that it requires a phase of sort of cognitive openness, which then gets activated, and you then familiarize yourself in a worldview and get socialized into it that support these extremist beliefs and possibly legitimizes also acting on those beliefs later on. I should add maybe one point in the spirit of proper science, which is that this field faces a lot of empirical challenges. It's not easy to do empirical fieldwork in this field for a number of reasons. And as a consequence of that, we are mostly talking about a qualitative or even theoretical body of literature. So while these are very valuable and adding a lot of ideas and concepts to the discussion, we do need a lot of more of robust fieldwork to validate these concepts before we can say that we have a solid psychological understanding of the processes surrounding political extremism. There's a number of factors which often apply, but obviously not in every context and situation. And I think it's useful if we think about these in 3 categories, which we can label ideology, identity, and injustice. So first, ideology. As a general rule, it is a very rewarding feeling if we adhere to any sort of belief system, whether that's a religion or any secular ism can work as well, anything like that, because it allows us to experience the feeling of working towards something that is greater than ourselves and even our lives and our communities. And that is a very positive feeling. And extremist groups kind of fit into this quite nicely, if you will, because adhering extremely to any belief like that just amplifies that feeling. Something similar is true for the second category, which is identification. Belonging to social groups, especially politicized groups, and especially those who can provide a unique and strong sense of in-group identity, is also a very rewarding and positive feeling. And again, extremist groups kind of by definition fulfill these criteria quite nicely and are therefore maybe attractive to people who are already alienating from mainstream society and looking for a stronger sense of identity. Because belonging to a group like that reduces our uncertainty that we might have about either us as a person or life in general. And the last category, feelings of or perceived injustices, can be a very strong motivator because this is an emotional mechanism. We know from studies that people more or less constantly compare the status quo of social groups they belong to, and status here can refer to things like social status, security, political participation rights as well. We compare that to either future expectations that we have for those groups that we are a member of, or we compare it to a reference outgroup of today. And whenever a gap emerges in this comparison between what is and what should be, that produces feelings of frustration and anger, which can later discharge into political attitudes and behaviors, among other things. So one simple example of that would be that if I'm a member of a social minority group that I feel is collectively and systematically discriminated against or even oppressed, And I believe that this discrepancy cannot be resolved within the social and legal norms of mainstream society. I might be more open to more extreme approaches to fix that political issues from my subjective point of view. So it's very intuitive to assume that people are, in general, when it comes to political action, motivated by certain policy issues or believing in a cause. But if we take that to its logical conclusion, that would mean that the people most strongly committed to a cause would become the extremists. And I think this holds true somewhat when it comes to political attitudes, or in this case, extremist attitudes, even though you could argue that that is kind of a truism because that's basically how these beliefs are defined in the first place. But when it comes to actual engagement behavior, things become much less clear because there's a lot of cases in which strong or even extreme political beliefs might be very, very widespread among a population. But only very few people will usually act on those beliefs at all. And those that do will usually choose very moderate forms of protest and political action rather than become violent extremists, let's say. Why is that? So from a psychological research perspective, at least, belief in the cause is a very unreliable and crude predictor and therefore of limited practical value. So the short answer is yes, but we need to be careful with that because any attempt to define, say, an extremist profile or even a vulnerability profile of people is a very slippery slope towards discriminatory practices. This has happened in the past, particularly among law enforcement in certain countries with rather poor results. So that's problematic. What's more interesting, and that's the longer answer, is what you refer to in your question as psychological vulnerabilities. And there's a number of factors we can discuss here. So things like a sense of grievance, a sense of group-based injustice, as we have discussed, feeling threatened, mental health issues can also contribute to that. So these are all signs from a psychological individual perspective that might lead to an alienation from society, respectively, and an opening and receptiveness towards maybe political radicalization as well. And more practically speaking, there might be signs or symptoms, if you will, that could be interesting to pay close attention to. So, for example, having very severe, and I mean clinical levels of severe problems of forming social relationships, for example, or dropping out of educational programs, things like that could be indicators, not by themselves, but like as indicators. And we might be well advised to pay closer attention to these things and how we can protect people who are in those kinds of situations from being exploited into and drawn into political extremism in the worst case. First of all, there is no clear indicator that education prevents extremism. So it's not the case that just by being more educated, you are somewhat less at risk of becoming radicalized. This is true for a number of case studies. It's very easy to see when we look at historical examples that a lot of extremist movements do not consist of just uneducated people. There might be some relationship when it comes to like no education at all versus like some parts of education, but I don't mean it like as a predictor of that. I think education systems in general, though, are a very structural element of most societies, and therefore are a tool to kind of hold everyone inside that system as well. So whenever something happens that lets people drop out of educational system, for example, by people opting out or people being expelled or something like that, this creates a risk because this automatically excludes you from a very fundamental structure of most societies, which can then lead to some of the mechanisms that we've discussed, such as seeking for alternative identities. So we did a study in 2020 in Iraq, across numerous cities in the country, together with, I believe, 10 partner organizations such as universities, NGOs, and such. And the idea was to investigate one of the mechanisms that we've discussed, which is self-related feelings of uncertainty, and subsequently whether that indeed increases intentions to engage in political collective action, where we very importantly discriminated or differentiated between moderate forms such as attending peaceful protests and more radical forms such as violent or illegal forms of taking political action. Iraq was selected in part because the country has had a very tumultuous and chaotic modern history. I mean, since 1980, that's 43 years, the country has not been formally at war for only a grand total of 13 years. And even those 13 years of so-called peacetime have been overshadowed by brutal dictatorship and violence. And I think two things immediately follow out of that historical backdrop. The first of which being that there is very clear demand by social work organizations and NGOs and other actors in the region of understanding political psychology in that country specifically, in that particular context. But on the flip side, that's the second element, it also means we need to be cautious when we interpret findings from studies like this outside of that context, because it's a very unique situation and field, which makes it very valuable, but also may limit its generalizability, if you will, of those findings. That particular setting is important because, as you referred to in your question, of course, there are very severe and direct psychological consequences of that conflict history. So some of that is quite obvious. You just have to, for instance, look at diagnoses of psychological trauma or depression statistics. By the way, similarly to the Syrian civil war, this affects a large number of children in the early stages of development as well, where if you get into the clinical assessments of their psychological state, that's just heartbreaking to say the very least. But there's also more subtle impacts on the Iraqi population, such as a general sense of frustration with the government's failure to establish security and a functioning society that is fighting corruption, among other things. And I think it's also important to mention one very positive point in my view, because in my experience, the Iraqi people have also become extremely resilient as a consequence of those conflicts. Now, obviously, that's for all the wrong reasons, but I think it paints a rather hopeful picture for human psychology and how we react to crisis, in addition to being something to be very proud of for those people as well. There are no controlled studies, so we cannot say for sure this is the case. There is a general link between mental health issues and increased openness to political extremism in some cases, and for certain mental health issues. And specifically, this includes traumatic events, because traumatic events, again by definition, but also how they play out psychologically, throw you out of your not only your comfort zone, obviously, but out of your very perception of the world, right? They completely challenge your existence, psychologically speaking, and throw you out of what is normally your perception on society and other things. And again, this can predispose you or make you vulnerable to new explanations that include radical political ideologies and extremist groups that specifically target those populations as well. This is definitely a case from a qualitative research perspective. There are studies that this is the case both within those countries, the countries of origin, as well as refugee communities, both internally and in other countries. The feeling of threat that many people in conflict settings directly experience and may not have experienced before, if that's the first conflict that breaks out in a particular region, can be traumatic in some extreme cases, and in other cases can form a sense of uncertainty, which can then also make you feel very uncomfortable, because as humans we don't like feeling uncertain about the future and our personal safety, especially because obviously physical and personal safety is a very fundamental need that we like to satisfy and not really like challenged. So when that happens, such as in the case of violent conflict, this can also open ourselves up for being vulnerable towards identity-seeking phases, which then can lead to political extremism in some cases as well. I would say from a psychological perspective, feelings of uncertainty goes hand in hand with failing to satisfy basic needs such as physical or personal safety of yourself or your loved ones, in that they both can cause you to look for reassuring alternative identities, which extremist ideologies, political ideologies more broadly, but extremist ideologies are stronger in this, can provide. And that can be dangerous, of course, because if that happens in a setting where people are put in a very chaotic and unstable environment anyway due to the conflict, that can open ourselves up to a lot of risk in this regard as well. The theory of self-affirmation is the main concept that we investigated in the Iraq study. And the key idea of that theory is that we have an overall self-image of who we are as a person, such as being a good friend or a person with a successful career, for example. And whenever this self-image gets threatened by feelings of uncertainty, we become defensive about it and we try to reinstate and restore our self-image as a result of that. Now, what's very interesting about this is that research shows that this process of self-affirmation can be compensatory. So I'll use an example. Let's say I really, really identify strongly with my work, but then disaster strikes and I lose my job for whatever reason. And that sends me off on like a psychological downward turn for the time being. I can then restore my sense of self, for example, by expressing much more extreme political views that I would otherwise do, and maybe even act on those views, because that sets me apart from people and therefore creates a new sense of unique identity, even though these political things have nothing to do with the original source of uncertainty, which was me losing my job. And that carries a very interesting implication for possibly defining intervention programs as well against violent extremism, because if people are offered alternative ways to express their unique identities as persons, they might be less susceptible to look for political ideologies to fill that gap. And that can be an interesting avenue to explore in the future. So oftentimes, when we think about troubled regions, they not only create fertile ground for political extremism, potentially, but also at the same time, a need for constructive activism to fix the trouble, essentially, right? And at the same time, in non-conflict environments, for example, something very similar applies, because productive or constructive political activism can be a very valuable part of civic society in basically any setting. But it's very tricky in practice, because political activism and extremism share a lot in common, right? They both manifest in social movements, which provide politicized, strong in-group identities to their members and ways to fight injustices, whether perceived or actual. So basically all of the motivations that I mentioned previously that you could apply to either activism or extremism. And we actually don't know for sure whether there is a fundamental difference between the two, or whether extremism is just a more intense form of political activism. There is in fact some evidence to suggest that there is a fundamental difference, psychologically speaking, but it's inconclusive. And maybe I can share two relevant insights from my own research just by convenience. In the Iraq study, we found that self-related feelings of uncertainty did indeed increase intentions to engage in more extreme forms of political action. But at the same time, there was also an effect on more moderate forms of political activism. Now, that effect was smaller in size, but it was still significant and positive. So there was a disproportionality, but it went into the same direction. In another study that we're currently trying to prepare for publishing, we are testing a different mechanism, which is perceptions of group-based injustice, where, to remind us, the mechanism goes, I am part of a social group that I feel is kept from reaching its potential, and that is an injustice. Now, feelings like that, we found, increase, again, intentions and engagement in more extreme forms of political action, but they actually decreased, so had a negative effect on more moderate forms. So there was a divergence, and that can be quite interesting also when it comes to trying to apply these insights towards policy more effectively. So first, I would reiterate that it is not advisable to try and derive extremist or vulnerability profiles based on characteristics. This was a thing primarily in the early 2000s among law enforcement in Western countries, still is nowadays, in response to very horrible terrorist attacks there. But as far as anyone can tell, these programs have been ineffective by and large and had very clear discriminatory tendencies. So that is problematic. What's way more interesting, and actually does already record some positive results, is an approach that is taken by many organizations and policy actors nowadays, which is called counter-narratives. And what these institutions would do is they would first identify the communication spaces in which potentially vulnerable people might be present. Oftentimes nowadays we're talking about specific social media communities. And then they would provide alternative narratives that challenge the extremist worldviews that might be presented there, so that these are not the only option on the menu for people who might be identity seeking or might be going through an identity crisis and therefore receptible to those kinds of ideologies. And that happens both in conflict regions, in places like Iraq, for example, and also in various other countries, such as preventing violent extremism in online spaces or right-wing extremism or any other type. Basically, this is something that is being practiced quite successfully today. I would also add one idea that is based on this finding that we had on the perceived injustice mechanism, which was this divergence where it actually predicts stronger engagement for extreme forms, but reduced engagement in moderate forms of political action. So there might be less of a risk of sort of accidentally suppressing productive and constructive activism, when really what you're trying to do is prevent violent extremism. And how to implement that? Well, that's of course quite tricky. Maybe two things that could be thought about would be to pay more attention and be more aware about group perceptions in society. That's a task for policymakers and leaders, and they should care, because no matter the country, no matter the state system, even the most dominant social group, it cannot be in their interest to have a violent insurgency rise up against them. So this is something that everyone should be able to get behind. And on the side of the general population, from which we try to protect people from becoming potentially radicalized, it can make sense in certain contexts to engage with vulnerable communities and clarify that non-violent forms of political action, for example, or in general more moderate and constructive forms of civic engagement, are the more effective political strategy because of many different factors. This has actually also been shown empirically, and therefore prevent that. Those could be two first steps to develop novel approaches, maybe based on that concept, unless of course we figure out a way to eliminate all injustices from the world, in which case that would also be worthwhile to pursue. So context is absolutely critical when interpreting findings, but also when trying to figure out which ones can be applied in which context, essentially. It is always relevant when doing field work to be very critical, self-critical and reflective about external validity, we call it, which means how much can we generalize our findings that we observe in one particular setting towards the wider world. The lowest validity you would have if you just put people in a lab setting, because that is very unrepresentative of actual decision environments for political action in particular. Therefore, studies that do this while adding valuable insights to the field are not very reliable when it comes to applying these insights in the natural field. That's why it's very important and valuable to go into these countries and also support data collection and observations in those particular settings. But it's a double-edged sword, because of course, once you do that, you kind of subject yourself to that particular setting, and you're also limited by that empirical field. So you can, depending on the study design, or depending on the mechanism that you're testing and how you're analyzing it, you can extrapolate and generalize your findings. Depending on your sample, it can be very easy to generalize to a national level. Beyond that, you have to be more cautious. And I would always be very careful in interpreting, especially contexts which are so related to the topic that you're investigating, such as political conflict, and then analyzing political behavior in those contexts. In general, something that has to be said when it comes to preventing radicalization, specifically when it happens like within our own social circles, for example, and when we notice that, is something that probably applies to any kind of prevention, which is the earlier the better. So when you start realizing that some close ones are going through an identity crisis, and you have the feeling or have signs of them trying to compensate that by engaging in political work rather than trying to fix other aspects of their life, maybe the ones from which the original uncertainty and identity crisis stems, that should be a moment for intervention as early as possible, to be very upfront about it. The later along that happens, generally speaking, it seems to be that the further along you are along the radicalization process, so to say, the more difficult those kinds of conversations become. And at a certain point, it might actually be counterproductive to seek confrontation and critically challenge those kinds of beliefs, because it can just cause people to completely withdraw from those kinds of interactions with non-radicalized people and push them even further into this bubble or communication space within they only see reaffirmation of those beliefs.